and allowed for safe access to take place for patients. Now, what I just described to you so far, and of course what happened was caregivers were the ones supplying the provision centers that are staying open, and Lara turned their head and then later made a proclamation this past year, 2018, because the system was not functioning that they'd created or the legislature created. And they stated in another emergency rule that they weren't going to punish the applicants who were temporarily open and running for their purchasing cannabis to sell to patients from caregivers. And just now the board, again, call it whatever you want, they extended or created a new rule that allows caregivers to provide cannabis to be put on the shelves at provisioning centers where patients can go and purchase cannabis. Now, what I described to you is the system in Michigan as regards to cannabis or marijuana. What I described to you is also this marijuana plant is also listed as Schedule 1. Now, what does it mean to put something on the controlled substances list or be scheduled? Well, each one of the schedules has a different definition. One, of course, being that it has no medical value and is harmful because of its highly addictive nature, which means there's no reason to research. It's just off the charts. That's what marijuana stands right now. Michigan also has a Schedule 2 marijuana in the circumstance if it should develop. This is the Senate Bill 660. Should it develop that the federal government decides to legalize marijuana or reschedule it, or there's some kind of authorization given. But if that was to happen, it would be pharmaceutical grade marijuana and it would be sold at pharmacies. So with those two things said, this is not a lawsuit that asks for marijuana to be rescheduled. This is a lawsuit that demands that marijuana be placed where it belongs, which is off the scheduling, because the system that I described to you and the way the legislature, the MMFLA, has been set up is not a system that could be defined as controlled. The Controlled Substances Act is specific as to drugs that are gotten through it and how they are gotten and the methods by which they're gotten, who they're going to get it from. And it is very clearly defined, unequivocally defined. Certain licenses have to be in effect, certain training and education have to be in effect in order to do this. The drugs that are put onto the schedule are run through DEA, research, passage, so-called passage, sometimes not, whatever it is. But it's certainly something that is a process that, in order to sell the drug, has to go through this super controlled system. It is then defined where it lays on the scheduling 2, 3, 4, 5. But when you look at what these substances are, they are all pharmaceutical drugs. They're all opiates. They're all drugs that are made and created by pharmaceutical companies that all went through that process that I just described. It is for everything else that is pills and bottles and manufactured and reproduced to the exact molecule to the extent that's possible, and been to be able to establish it time and time again for approval to do that. Now, that is what a controlled substance looks like. That's what a controlled substance list looks like in order for a drug to be on there. For some reason, all these years, there you got that plant, marijuana, on this controlled substance list. But putting that absolute absurdity aside for a second, when we talk about how marijuana is being described today, sold through the state, taxing by the state for people that are paying $66,000 to get regulatory fees and make an application. This is not a controlled substance. The state, by its own doing, has literally redefined it and pulled it off of where it was before. They have, Jeff, what's my word? They've displaced cannabis from the controlled substance list by their own actions, so we say. And ultimately, we will be asking the court to remove it from the controlled substance list. And that's the lawsuit. And the reason why it's so important that John Sinclair is our plaintiff in significance of this, to tie it all back together, is that John Sinclair, of course, was a case in 1971, 72, the Michigan Supreme Court, and in an opinion that still remains precedent today. Those justices stated that marijuana is not a narcotic. It should be treated instead like alcohol and not a narcotic. This is before the Controlled Substances Act was initiated, but a narcotic was a dangerous drug. And in that opinion, they said marijuana is not. And the issue, of course, was deemed as it's unconstitutional, they said, to categorize marijuana as a narcotic. And as the history goes, later Michigan adopted the Controlled Substances Act, and marijuana, even though it was labeled as Schedule 1, was not punished as Schedule 1, and for that reason alone was it able to remain on the books or not invalidated. However, as we stand here today, it cannot be said anymore, it cannot be reconciled. It's beyond reconcilable. It is absurd to continue to believe that cannabis can be considered a scheduled drug. That's it. That's all I got to say. Does that make my case? Anybody?
Yes.
Jim, did I make my case?
Yes.
I'm going to play a song and then we can
All right.
call it maybe.
Excellent.
What else are we going to talk about?
Well, there's plenty to talk about. We could talk about the everlasting government shutdown. That's always fun.
Hold on, no, we do have to tell us, as it goes sometimes in the, there's things that you learn about, the different people, and even though the story about John Sinclair is just a super fascinating story, turns out that there are even more interesting things about his case, and he told some interesting stuff, and of course Jeff has been in the rabbit hole about some of the crazy coincidences that arose out of it, and we have Esteban here who will explain part of his involvement with the whole, some weird connection to the John Sinclair somehow, so whatever, and also how significant it was that John Sinclair's case and what it did to a very significant part of history in America. Yep. That kind of stuff.
Esteban is losing his shit.
Okay, he's going to hold it together. I'm finding.
Did you ask me a question?
No, not yet.
Oh, I didn't think so.
All right, so this is Planet Creatures. We'll be right back.
Oh, I thought I was going to go into the
No,
explanation.
not yet. Not right now.
Not right now.
Michael, we made you some hash.
Yes.
Okay.
We're over here making you
I
your
made you some
favorite
hash.
hash.
You're over here.
Always dancing down the street with your sway blue eyes. Every new boy that you meet, he doesn't know the real surprise. Here she comes again when she's dancing beneath the starry sky. Ooh, she'll make you fly. Here she comes again when she's dancing beneath the starry sky. I kinda like the way she gives. She's my baby. milky suede blue eyes. And every new boy that you meet doesn't know the real surprise. Here she comes again. When she's dancing beneath the stars. Here she comes again. She'll make you feel. Here she comes again. When she's dancing beneath the stars. Here she comes again. I kinda like the way she dips. 'Cause she's my best friend's girl. She's my best friend's girl. She used to be mine. She's so fine. My best friend's girlfriend. My best friend's girlfriend. She used to be mine. My best friend's girlfriend. Yeah, yeah. My best friend's girlfriend. She used to be mine. My best friend's girlfriend. Yeah, yeah. My best friend's girlfriend. She used to be mine. My best friend's girlfriend.
Get you going, buddy. Oh, it's good. You got this off Amazon, didn't you?
It was 40 years ago today. Sergeant Pepper taught the band to play.